What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. John Hawley, who you should be familiar with from episode 57, where we discussed chrononutrition and intermittent fasting. This one is a little different from the usual fare, as we discuss strategies to maximize adaptations for endurance exercise performance. More specifically, our primary discussion topic was train low. We also talk about how to conceptualize training for elite athletes, including some of the limitations of studying this population and the value of in the trenches experience. If you enjoyed the recent episode with Dr. Andy Galpin, you should be keen to hear John's thoughts here. Throughout the episode, John shares several truly fascinating anecdotes. Other topics of conversation include the mechanistic basis for train low, how to program train low, including the number of sessions per week, how long a mesocycle should last, percentage of glycogen depletion necessary to elicit adaptations, the efficacy of different types of train low strategies, and where the research seems to point in terms of which one is the best. I thought this was a phenomenal conversation, and I assure you that even if on the surface this topic isn't your cup of tea, there are some golden nuggets for anyone with a general interest in exercise science. Without further ado, I present to you my discussion with Dr. John Hawley. Competitive race walking is intense. I was fascinated by it. I flipped it on, and literally within 10 minutes, some guy from Japan went off to the sides and vomited and got right back on the course. And I was like, these guys are extreme. Like, to a lot of people on the surface, they're like, competitive race walking, like, what is this? This is ridiculous. Like, these guys get after it.
No, I'll be honest. I was a bit like you. I was a bit skeptical. It was like, who can whisper the loudest? Because it's very hard to see who's lifting, whose foot's off the ground and this, that, and the other. But Louise worked very close with Jared Talent, who's our Olympic gold medalist, and I think retrospectively won about 4 or 5 other medals because various Russians and Italians were pinged for doping. But when I saw Louise and the Supernova studies working with them, it's crazy how fast they walk. Number one, I mean, it's just ridiculous. And they're animals. I mean, there's no question. They train incredibly hard. My respect for them just went through the roof. I mean, Evan Dunphy, who was the bronze medalist there, we've worked closely with him, and Louise has. I mean, these guys are absolute athletes. There's no question like that. So it's changed my paradigm just watching Louise work with them. And we've got a study scheduled, or Louise has, I should say, for January. But whether we can bring all these guys back into the country again, I'm not sure. But yeah, it's a fun race to watch. And yeah, I know exactly what you were talking about when right, sort of yeah, it's merciless. But of course the heat there, I mean, if you're an athlete, the IOC doesn't care about the athletes. I mean, why would you hold the Olympics in 30 degrees and 90% humidity if you really were concerned about the athletes? I mean, I think, again, one of the best performances, though, was Kipchoge in the men's marathon. I mean, that was a masterclass of running. I mean, it almost looked like he knew exactly when he was going to go, and it didn't matter who was with him. He might have just had to run a little bit faster if someone. Wasn't it incredible? If you watch the marathon, just beautiful to watch.
Yes, and in relation to competitive endurance sports, this more or less brings us into our main topic of discussion today. This actually just came to mind. So I looked it up, and the last episode you were on was episode 57. As of tomorrow morning, episode 94 will be coming out. The last time you were on, we discussed chrononutrition and intermittent fasting. And today we're going to be mainly talking about train low strategies, which are connected, right? I mean, we're talking about not eating to optimize health, body composition, and now performance. I guess anytime I'm looking to discuss, what are the potential benefits of not eating, you're the guy to talk to in this equation, huh?
Okay, well, it's not quite not eating if we're talking about training low. There's a big difference. So again, just for your listeners to clarify, when we talk about training low or training high, we're not talking about altitude here. We're talking about manipulating the carbohydrate stores in the muscle, mainly in the muscle. Yeah, and as your listeners will know, that's the the form of carbohydrate stored in the muscle is glycogen. So this has been I guess something that athletes have used for a lot longer than the scientists have known about it. And I'll give you a little anecdote here. I remember being at a conference in Switzerland. It must have been around about the early 90s, let's say. I can't put an exact figure on it. And Frank Shorter, the US Olympic marathon champion, was there. He won in 72 and he was the silver medalist in 1976, although really he should have been a double gold medalist because Vladimir Sapinski, the East German, later came out and said he was doped. So in my opinion, Frank Shorter is a double Olympic gold medalist. Anyway, we just published a study in Journal of Applied Physiology, which was our study of train low with well-trained athletes, with cyclists, and we can talk about that a little bit later. And I was, really excited to share this with Frank Shorter, who was sitting at our table, and he just sat back and he said, "Let me tell you something here, John." And I sort of thought, well, I'm going to listen to this guy, two Olympic gold medalists. He said, "This is what I used to do in 1969 and 1970. I used to do a really hard run, a rep session on the track on a Saturday afternoon." He said, "That was to deplete my glycogen stores." And I'm like, okay, this guy obviously knows what he's talking about. He said, "Then I would deliberately withhold carbohydrate from my evening meal and have high protein and high fat. And the next day I would go out and run my 20-miler at close to 5-minute mile pace." He said, "I think I was doing this a little bit before you scientists came along and coined the term train low." And I was literally gobsmacked. I said, "Well, how did you know how to do this?" He said, "We tried anything in those days." And he said, coaches and athletes were very much in the sort of trial and error mode. In other words, they'd try something. If it didn't work, they'd moved on. And of course, the best experiment is the experiment of one. If it works for you, that's fantastic. For example, fat adaptation, giving athletes high fat diets, works for some athletes. It does. Some athletes in the Hawaii Ironman use that strategy. For others, it's a complete disaster. So that was an anecdote that got me thinking, well, athletes and coaches are probably miles ahead of the sports scientists. And, I was so proud of the study that we'd done, and he'd probably, 6 years earlier already knew what we knew. So we learn from the coaches and athletes. And often I think, Michael, in the sports science world, we merely come along and, if you like, validate what coaches and athletes are doing, and we can explain the mechanisms. But make no mistake, they're doing it in the field before we come up with all these innovations in the lab.
That's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea, but I love opening with that anecdote because my roots are more so in training for muscle hypertrophy, training to maximize strength, competed in powerlifting, focused on bodybuilding right now. And in that realm, if we go back to the 1950s with Steve Reeves, and then followed by the golden era with Arnold Schwarzenegger, a lot of the things these guys were doing, both when it comes to nutrition and training, have just started to become validated by the research within like the past 15 years. And it's just so fascinating that these guys, were able just by trial and error to come along and settle upon these ideas, which we know today, we can confidently say these are evidence-based approaches based on a plethora of studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it's interesting you say that for the strength area as well. I wasn't aware of that because, as my background isn't particularly in that, but that's interesting to hear that there's a parallel between the power of the strength athletes and also the endurance athletes. And yeah, as I said, maybe sports scientists should be hanging around the gyms a bit more, or the running track, and seeing what these guys do. Look, another example is, and it's not off tangent, it's directly related. It is the swimming. I never understand why the swimmers spend hours and hours and hours going up and down the pool at speeds which seem to me are totally unrelated to race pace. Yet, I've got a son who's a swimmer trying to get a US college scholarship. They do thousands of yards, and I'm thinking, the most he competes in is events which last two and a bit minutes. Why is he swimming 4 kilometers in a session? And the coaches will tell you, it's feel for the water, it's economy, it's technique and everything else. And, who am I to argue? I've produced no Olympic gold medalist. So, I mean, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. And again, an anecdote, I remember many, many years ago, and some of your older listeners will have heard of a coach in New Zealand called Arthur Lydiard. He was responsible for coaching Peter Snell, Murray Halberg. In the 60s, a whole host of gold medalists came from New Zealand, and subsequently John Walker, Rod Dixon, Dick Quacks were were very much in the running scene in the mid-70s. I remember being at a seminar with him, and I was really proud. I think it was in the era where PowerPoint slides were really new and trendy, and I had all these slides and gave a talk on something or other to do with endurance athletes. And then in the question time, he turned around, and he was quite a stubborn guy and quite outspoken. He said, "Nice slides, John. How many Olympic athletes have you coached?" And I was like, whoa, I wish I could have just hidden under the table. It was a case of theory on the one hand with my knowledge, and practice on the other hand with his training and his coaching. So I always remember that, and I always tell the students that we might know a lot, but on the other hand, it's the coaches who implement all these strategies and techniques. And I have always had utmost respect for coaches. Even before Arthur Lydiard cut me down in flames.
That's so interesting, because I think people like to point to scientists being in their ivory tower, right? And even having an ego about them. And people from the outside looking in would be like, Dr. John Hawley, Dr. Louise Burke, these are legends in the area of sports science. And for you to have a son who is practicing in a way that doesn't mechanistically make sense to you, and I don't know what the background of this coach is, if he has education in sports science, physiology, whatever, but you just look internally and you're like, I haven't produced any Olympic gold medalists, so I'm just going to let them have at it. Whereas most people would be like, how could you, with all your knowledge, and your wife with all her knowledge, just let these practices, which just seem completely unscientific, just go on and be like, no, it's probably fine. This guy knows what he's doing, because I haven't been in the trenches, coaching athletes.
Yeah. Look, the other thing, of course, is that any parents listening to this will know that their teenage sons or daughters don't listen to their parents. So it doesn't matter if you've got the world's best sports nutritionist or exercise physiologist as your parents. Your parents know nothing. I mean, and again, parents who are listening to this will relate to that, because we can tell Jack to do this after training and eat this and do that and lift this and then the other. But at the end of the day, he actually says many times to me, he says, "Dad, you're not my coach." And that probably sums it up, Mike.
I think so. Now, in the opening, you gave a general overview of what Train Low is. Specifically, we're talking about carbohydrates here. I think to follow up before we get into the rationale behind why Train Low might be efficacious is just to further open up the different Train Low strategies. So what are the different ways that an athlete could potentially train low?
All right, that's a good question. So let's try and set the stall out here so your readers have got or your listeners, I should say, have got a better understanding. So the original studies that were done looking at manipulating the stores of glycogen in the muscle involved a strategy where athletes would train twice a day. So they'd train in the morning, and then they'd deliberately try and withhold as much carbohydrates as they could for the rest of the day, with the second session, sometimes several hours later, but often 5 or 6 hours, that would be the session that was commenced with low glycogen. And that was the original study which came out of Ben Salteen's lab, albeit with very, very untrained subjects. So they took a bunch of untrained subjects, they had them train twice a day. They did a very sophisticated model where they had one leg training twice a day and the other leg as acting as a control. And what they actually found was that the leg that trained low, in other words, commencing training with low glycogen, around 50% of the training sessions, had a much greater time to exhaustion, had some metabolic adaptations, which we can discuss later, which were very favorable for endurance. So that was the study which really stimulated the scientific interest. Then there was a whole host of studies, and you hinted at it in the introduction about, fasting and withholding food. So there was also, whether you should commence training in the fasted state with the knowledge there that blood glucose may be a little bit lower overnight and the such like. All these have evolved, and I'd say the state of the art now is where we're at, which is really where we sleep low. And I'll explain that strategy if you like. So what we do now is, instead of having the athletes necessarily have to do 2 sessions and withhold carbohydrate for a whole day, we don't think that's a very practical strategy. Firstly, the athletes are pretty angry people when their blood glucose is low and their glycogen's low and they're walking around for 5 or 6 hours and they know the next training session is going to hurt. So what we do now is we have them come into the lab or in the field, but we've obviously done this in the lab and published those studies, where they come in and they do a very hard interval training session. And it's basically a session which we know from our muscle biopsies depletes around 50% of muscle glycogen. Then we have them sleep low. And what I mean by that is we withhold carbohydrate from that evening meal. We give them high protein and high fat. We don't withhold all carbohydrate, but we withhold enough such that we know that muscle glycogen will not be resynthesized. Then the following morning, they come to the lab or they go to the field or go outside, whatever they're doing, whether they're cyclists or runners and the such like, and they do that session with low glycogen. Now, one of the trade-offs of that is, I said, yeah, they feel pretty crappy, to be honest. And we know that the power output in those sessions is around 7 to 8% lower. So the first thing the coaches said to us is, well, why do we want athletes to train at an intensity which is 7 or 8% lower and they feel really bad? And that's where we came along and tried to do some of the mechanistic studies to show that, you know, when you did this, you forced some of the training adaptations, and perhaps that's a good bridge into why we actually do it. But that's what we now term as, if you like, state of the art. We deliberately get the athlete to deplete their muscle glycogen the night before, sleep with low carbohydrate availability. And let's be honest, most of the adaptations, as you know, are going on while we're recovering, not while we're actually training. So the recovery process is very important. So they've got literally a 12-hour window with very low muscle glycogen stores. And that triggers a lot of things in the muscle. And then they come out the next morning and do a training session with low glycogen.
And we'll definitely get into what's going on in the muscle specifically. But since you highlighted this concept of sleep low there, I think this does naturally segue into a recent review that I wanted to discuss with you, which was from, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but Gedgel and Nybo. Just came out 2021, and they looked at different train low strategies in highly trained athletes. So I believe the females had to have at least a VO2 max of 55, and for men this was 60. And on the whole, they found that periodized carbohydrate intake, basically utilizing train low sessions, on the whole did not have an advantageous effect on endurance performance adaptations. However, there were 2 studies within this review that specifically utilized this sleep low strategy. And those were the ones that saw these positive adaptations. And both of these studies were from the same author, I believe. It was Marquette. But this all comes together with what you're saying, I guess, because, you know, for someone who's not, well-read in this field, and they're looking at this recent review, they might think on the whole, well, train low, it's still early, on average, most strategies don't work. And then this one strategy that did work, it came from the same author. You know, we like to see different labs replicating the same results, but it sounds like from you, someone who's done so much research in this field, you would be confident in this sleep low strategy. Is that correct?
Okay, well, there's a lot of good points there, and I'm very familiar with the review that you're talking about, of course. I guess a couple of points here just to clarify. Firstly, I get the fact that you said the females were 55 mils and above and the males 60. I mean, that's not an elite athlete, number one, all right? So that's the first point there. And I think one of the mistakes that we make, and this is a general observation, not just specific to the train low, is that we often take studies in the literature which have used highly trained subjects, but I'm highly trained. I train 15 hours a week, but I'm not elite. So we have to make the distinction there between someone who's doing a large training volume, which is commensurate with what an athlete may or may not do, but doesn't have the performance capacities. And that's a really important point. And, you know, Louise and I have often spoken about this as conferences and said, well, look, you know, here's a study on glycogen, train low, caffeine, bicarbonate, whatever it is. It was done on this cohort. It doesn't necessarily mean it can translate to another cohort. Now, the studies that you're mentioning, which did show an advantageous effect, were done in highly trained triathletes. In fact, we're co-authors on one of those papers. So I know the studies very, very well. And again, these were members of the French national team in the one case, and in our studies, we've got very highly trained athletes as well. the trained athlete or the highly trained elite athlete is a different animal to a moderately trained person who's doing perhaps the same amount of training. You know, genetics are completely different in most cases. Back to your questions, though, directly relevant. So that was the first point I want to make. You've got to remember, Mike, that in every case, an athlete is a study of n equals 1. And as I say, we've done studies on fat adaptation, on training low. We do see improvements in some people we don't see improvements. I can say with absolute confidence that in all our train low studies, the athletes never go worse. And that's a point. Now, if you're a coach, you say, well, I'm not in the business of, staying on a level playing field. I want an advantage. The thing that we haven't really measured, but I can tell you that when Louise talks to her race walkers, particularly in some of the supernova studies, is the psychological advantage that this brings. It's almost like, and I'll use the analogy of altitude training. Athletes go to altitude, they often run slower, it hurts, they get adaptations in the blood, but certainly when they're at altitude, you don't feel that sparkling. There's no question that when you come down to sea level, you race usually much, much better. The analogy there is that some of the carbohydrate strategies, the training with low muscle glycogen, I think have some sort of a mental effect as well. In other words, we haven't measured it, but the athletes who do this know they've been through purgatory for 2 or 3 weeks, and that's usually the training block that we use. And I think they are mentally tougher. And if you talk, for example, to Evan Dumfries, who won the bronze medal in the walk at the Olympic Games here, he will tell you exactly that. He said, I'm not sure if it, did some stuff to my muscle, which you guys measure. I mean, these are sort of his quotes, but he said it made me very tough upstairs. And that's a really important point to remember, I think. So we probably can't neglect that, and we can't necessarily measure that. Now, sorry, it's not a short soundbite, but this is another important point. I'm not sure, Mike, that we measure performance in the laboratory as we could do in the field. And often I think, some of our tests that we use, we do a preload for a couple of hours and then a time trial, or sometimes a time to exhaustion. But some of the times we're trying to do a true performance task. But often I'm not sure that what we call the coefficient of variation, the margin of error in our tests in the lab, I'm not sure they're sensitive enough to pick up the small improvements, which are really vital to an elite athlete. So that's a point, I think, for generally all sports scientists, we need better laboratory tools, or better still, like Louise in the supernova studies, we move out in the field and have a proper race under race conditions in a real world situation. So there's several points there. I've meandered a little bit, but I think they're all pretty valid. So I don't get worried when a meta-analysis or review comes out that says, this doesn't work on average, because on average, we're not concerned with the average person. The coach is concerned with their athlete. And again, I would say to coaches who are using this, if your athlete does respond to it favorably, then you use it. If you doesn't particularly, then you move on and try something else. But remember that every athlete is different. I could take a group of athletes and train them all the same. They wouldn't all have the same performance at the end of the training block. So as you know, from resistance lifting and everything else, it's an n equals 1, and the coach is looking for the advantage with their athlete. They're not really worried what the guy in the next lane does or whether they respond or not.
This is kind of a side tangent, but I can't express enough how much I love that your thoughts on this topic are more or less completely aligning with Andy Galpin's, who I recently had on the podcast, and our conversation centered around maximizing strength and muscle hypertrophy. And we more or less discussed how, we have these studies on quote unquote resistance trained subjects that have been lifting weights 3 times a week for 6 months. Right. And then, even when we do get people who are, highly trained, right? They've been going at it for 5 years. We don't know about the quality of their training, but they've been in the gym, consistently and frequently for 5 years. And then, we're supposed to be able to pick up changes in muscle hypertrophy over a college semester. Like, considering how gradual and slow this process is, like, are the techniques even sensitive enough to pick these up? And the fact that you're making very similar points when it comes to endurance training, I think is going to be really refreshing for the listeners, people who, follow the research to some degree, but they might not have like a formal background in methods and really understand these studies. Like, it can be overwhelming and confusing when you see these different results and they don't know how to interpret them. But when you have the best in the business, yourself and Andy Galpin kind of talking about, like we can only make so much out of these studies. And, when it comes to the best of the best, really we can't undervalue anecdote in this equation. I think that's useful, and it can make the training process and nutrition process a lot of fun, because it's more or less, hey, you should be experimenting, you should be doing different things, because you probably won't get to the optimal approach for you just relying on the science, even though it is really informative and it's going to help.
Look, you've made some great points there, and I'll have to go back and listen to that other podcast, but because I haven't listened to that. But it's good to hear that in a parallel universe, the same thing are being said. Look, I'd be the first to know that we don't know everything by a long stretch, and as I said earlier on, the coaches are who we usually learn from, and that's very, very important. I mean, let's just throw a tangent out there again. Who would have thought that beetroot juice and the work that Andy Jones is doing at Exeter, how on earth would you come up with that? I mean, that's just bonkers. But again, things, you've got to try different things. Different things work for different athletes. And I think that's very, very important to remember that, Louise's phrase again, to pinch something from my wife, is there is not a one size fits all. And that's a really important point. And I say that when I'm talking to groups of athletes, this is going to work for some of you. For some of you, it's not. Let's try it. If it works, let's keep it in the toolbox. If it doesn't, let's discard it. Let's move on to something else. I mean, I've been to talks with some sports scientists who you will know who, literally Ivy Tower type thing. Well, this happens in the lab and we can do this and we can show a significant statistical improvement. I'm like, I don't really care. Does it work in the field? Does the athlete improve their performance? Is the coach going to buy into this? And that's really, really important. And I think we lose track sometimes of that. We publish these wonderful studies under horrendously well-controlled conditions, but life isn't like that. We're locked in now. I can't train. I've got a rowing ergometer in my living room. I've got a bike in my living room. That's not the same. I can row very well on that ergometer, but put me on the water, I'm a different beast. So again, it's trial and error. And I know it sounds unscientific to come back to that, but trial and error is pretty much where we're at, I think, with some of the strategies in both sports nutrition and exercise physiology. And I think we should acknowledge that and try and move on with that in mind.
On the topic of the value of in the trenches experience, can I ask whether the Olympic endurance athletes were using Train Low for this past Olympics? Is there any insight you can share about that?
You'll have to get Louise on a program and ask her all about that. Look, she works very, very closely with them. I mean, look, it's part of their toolbox. There's not one strategy that fits all, and there's certainly not one training technique which is suitable. And a good example of that is, I'll go back to my son, who's a swimmer at the moment, and trying to make it to a US college. He's a guy who doesn't need the huge volumes of training, I don't think. He can get fit very fast. Now, whereas other people, they miss 2 weeks, 3 weeks of endurance training, they're almost back to square one. So I think everyone's, as I said, very individual in their responses. And it's the coach who really picks up those nuances and says, well, this athlete perhaps, needs pushing a bit harder. Yeah, we can back off with this athlete. This athlete can handle 2 train low sessions a week, for example, whereas this one's going to fall into a heap. And that's another interesting, as usual in our conversations, we go all over, Mike, but I'll give you another quick anecdote. When our first Train Low study came out, bearing in mind we'd only used 2 sessions a week for 3 weeks, so a total of 6 Train Low sessions, I got a phone call from an irate coach of distance runners. He said, my runners, they're all falling into a heap. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, we're following your Train Low strategy. They're running terribly. They're overtrained. They're sick. They're ill. I said, whoa, hold on. So what are you doing? He said, we've done 5 sessions a week of training low. I said, well, that's not what the paper said. He said, what do you mean? I said, that's not what the paper said. He said, no, you did 2, but 5 has to be better. I said, no, 5's a disaster. And I can tell you exactly what would happen if you did this 5 times. So again, it was a case of misinterpreting the science, and more is not always better.
Yeah, let's expand on how to practically apply the strategy then. So you've laid out here that when it comes to the, best method on average at the moment, it seems to be this sleep low strategy with a fasted training session in the morning. And I believe you said in the evening session before, so there's around 50% glycogen depletion, right?
Yeah, that session, Mike, very quickly we do 8 times 5 minutes repetitions at
Right.
around 80 to 85% of VO2 max. So it's a pretty hard interval training session. And the point there is that session is not compromised. It's high quality. Whereas if you do the twice a day training, that second section is low quality. So they get a high quality session in, sleep low, come back the next morning and do usually a prolonged endurance session with very low muscle glycogen.
Yeah, so let's tick a couple more boxes here just to at least give the listener something to keep in mind if they're a coach and they're interested in utilizing this approach with their athletes. So some variables to cover here would be around the length of a block of training that they would need to utilize this to see some positive adaptations. And you touched on the frequency, not 5 times per week doing this. And I think the last variable would be some more nuance about what that morning training session might look like, considering that that's an athlete with low muscle glycogen and probably liver, considering the overnight fast.
Yeah, good points. I'll add a fourth one there as well. The swimmers don't seem to respond very well to this, or a technique sport. So at the moment, we've only got data on runners and cyclists. So that's an important point. You know, coaches often say, well, train low. What about that in swimming and stuff? To the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen a lot of coaches using this in the pool. I may be wrong. There may be coaches out there and it'd be interesting to hear from them. But at the moment, I'm just going to talk exclusively about runners and cyclists, because we know it's easy to deplete leg muscle glycogen, you know, smaller muscle mass in swimming and such like. Maybe technique starts to deteriorate. I don't know, but let's just keep it to that. Okay, so your first point was how long? And again, we've done in the laboratory, but now we've backed it up with anecdotes from the field. I'd say a minimum of 2 weeks and a maximum of 4. So our studies have been right in the sweet spot there of around about 3 weeks duration. When is the good question? And that's a really good one. And it's not one I can answer with 100% certainty. We used to think this would be really good in the pre-season training block, when you're building that large aerobic base. But some of the athletes use this in the sort of 6 weeks before a major competition. So I think the jury's probably out on that one. Whether you're going to get adaptations in the muscle as short out as 6 weeks before a major competition, particularly if you're an already well-trained athlete, I doubt it. And that comes into the Evan Dunphy box there of maybe it's a psychological tool to use right before competition. The other one, which again, I picked up from coaches rather than any experience or scientific evidence, is I've had a lot of athletes and some team sport players as well say, I've read your papers on Train Low and I've been injured. Is this a way I can get back my fitness quicker? And I'm like, oh my goodness, I never really thought of that. Thank you. In theory, the answer is yes. If you can train low without aggravating your existing injury, or when you're coming back from rehab, can you get from A to B faster with Train Low? Absolutely, I would say. Now, I can't quote you a paper on that, but in theory, it makes perfect sense. And again, this was a team sport, athletes and soccer players who said, look, we can't run flat out on the pitch, but we can certainly cycle. We've used your Train Low strategies. We think we're getting back quicker than if we'd done other alternate methods. And I'm thinking, well, yes, that's probably very, very true. So I've just given you a few scenarios there. As far as the session in the morning goes, I think that was your third point there. So I would say, a couple of times a week. Some athletes can handle 3, but I tend to be on the conservative side there. I would say that evening session needs to be a high intensity quality session, because when you're training low, as I hinted at earlier, usually the power outputs or speeds are around about between 6 and 8% lower. So that next morning session is usually what we would call a steady state aerobic session. It's the highest power output that you can sustain for, in the case of a cyclist, 2 or 3 hours. And that's normally what we get the guys to do. Now, as you've pointed out very accurately, Mike, if you've had an overnight fast or very little carbohydrate, your liver glycogen stores are likely to be a little bit tapped out as well. So we have no problem in the latter stages of that morning session supplementing with a bit of exogenous carbohydrate while they're on the bike or the run. That's not an issue, because that is not muscle glycogen that we're manipulating, and you don't want them to stop because they're hyperglycemic. So hopefully, again, that's answered some of your main points. But again, I want to stress that they're not sort of rules set in stone, and each athlete can experiment. And some of your listeners may be doing this 3 times a week. There is no right answer to the exact quantities that they should be doing. But again, I would experiment with this. Have I done it? Yes, of course I have. I've done it, and I know those sessions where we used to train twice a day, the second session is excruciating, and it's demoralizing to see. First of all, your SRM crank or whatever power meter you've got on your bike, 5 or 6 kilometers slower. But the other thing is you can't hit target heart rates either. And that's an important practical point for the athlete. If the velocity or power output is lower, don't try and hit the normal training heart rates that you're trying to hit. You're going to kill yourself. So again, these sessions, bottom line here, I usually get the athlete to look at their rating of perception of effort and say, right, you should be rating this at a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10. Throw your heart rate away, or throw your heart rate monitor away for this session. And also, don't get hung up on your power meter, because your power outputs are gradually going to come down when you train low, at least in the acute phase.
Where to put these weeks of training low in is really intriguing to me. And I'm curious if any, at least mechanistic evidence comes to mind in terms of, these adaptations and are they around for the long haul, or when they might dissipate? Because, excuse me trying to connect everything to lifting weights, but I can't help myself. If we consider powerlifting and, we're trying to maximize our strength on a given day. And to do that, throughout the macro cycle, we're not going to just be doing singles and doubles every training session. We're probably going to have this peaking block to maximize this very specific fitness quality for this certain day, right? And then we also accept that in the off season, when our volume is a little bit higher, our average rep range is a bit higher, so lower intensity or load on the bar, we accept that 1RM strength is probably going to diminish to some appreciable degree. So with that in mind, what do we have any idea what might be happening in terms of these mitochondrial adaptations? We have these periods of train low. Do they stick around for a few weeks? Because I think that if there is any data, that would be super informative, right, for where we might put this in the training cycle.
Yeah, look, you're on the ball there, but we have thought of that. The problem with many of these studies is we do these interventions, and we let the athletes disappear back into the field, or we don't bring them back into the lab. We have really no mechanistic data which looks at the long-term effects of this. We have highly trained athletes who do this and have done it for many, many years, and it's anecdotal evidence that they think it works and the such like. So the answer to, do we have mechanistic evidence to show that, AMPK or PGC1 or some of these alphabet soup enzymes or transcription factors are up? The answer to that is simply absolutely not. We don't know, which is unfortunate. Do we have evidence that in short-term studies of 3 weeks duration, similar to some of the lab studies that we've done, that we get an upregulation of certain enzymes and some mitochondrial biogenesis, and some of these signaling proteins are upregulated? Yes, absolutely. No question about that. So you get those adaptations. Now, whether they persist for periods, as you said, that are prolonged and after a major competition, we don't know. But I would use your analogy there. It doesn't really matter, because if you're aiming for a competitive peak on a certain day and your train low strategy has been aimed at that and your performance has improved, and then you're going to come down and have a cycle before the next competition, then does it really matter if those adaptations are there 2 weeks or 3 weeks afterwards? I might add again as a tangent that we have looked at train low in resistance training. We have done that, a study by Donna Camera published a few years ago, there is absolutely no advantage whatsoever, as you would know well firsthand. I mean, if I walked into a gym and said to, some of the big guys, how about withholding carbohydrates and this, that, and the other, they'd obviously look at you as though I was crazy. So there is no advantage for you guys to even think about doing that. All right. So unless you want to lift, 50% of what you can normally lift, it's just not going to work.
Fantastic. There's actually been in recent years, like some controversy about carbohydrate needs for lifters because, a lot of people argue, well, compared to, aerobic training for a marathon, you're just not depleting the same percentage of carbohydrate in a resistance training session. And sure, we can take that and say that like maybe you don't need 8 grams per kg of carbs per day, but like still definitely like there's no good reason to train fasted. So it's like, okay, maybe you don't need 8 grams. Maybe you can go down to 4 and be completely fine. But that doesn't mean like, oh, now we don't need carbs before our workouts. Like that's just like, no, definitely keep eating the carbohydrates.
Look, I mean, you're raising good points there. I mean, yeah, I can see absolutely no scientific evidence, at least. I'm not too sure about the anecdotal because I'm not a big guy who hangs around in the gym with big guys. But 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate would seem absolutely ridiculous and nonsensical for me. But on the other hand, if you're going to take it down to 2 or 3 grams per kilogram of body mass, I think you'd probably start to get into trouble. And I think although you get through an acute session, perhaps with a little bit of a lowered carbohydrate availability, over time and doing split sessions like you do if you're serious power training or weightlifting, you would fall into a heap. There's no question about that. So yeah, I'm not advocating 8 to 10 grams per day, but I'm not advocating 2 to 3 or train low either. So let's get that quite clear. This isn't for the strength train fraternity out there.
For sure. Now you got into the mechanistic basis for train low a little bit there, but I would love the deep dive for our listeners if you would be so kind to share what's going on in the muscle that is more or less eliciting these positive adaptations, because as you touched on, the actual performance in these sessions is significantly compromised and it's miserable, but yet there's good reason to do this. So what's going on in the muscle?
All right. Well, let's just talk about a few things as my wife would call them, alphabet soup here. And I'll try and step your readers through this, or your listeners. I keep saying readers because I'm so used to writing at the moment. Not actually spoken to a real human being or given a lecture for about 20 months now. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of things in the muscle and hopefully they'll make sense. We have an enzyme called the AMPK, activated protein kinase. And some of your listeners may have heard of this. This is an enzyme which responds to the energy status of the cell, in this case, the muscle cell. So think of it like a petrol tank. When the fuel in the muscle is low, the gauge starts flashing, on your lights. Actually, I'll have to another anecdote here. My wife can drive for miles and miles with the petrol gauge flashing. I'm like, you need no petrol. I know how low it can go. I'm not sure. And that there's a reason for that anecdote, Mike, because we're not sure how low your glycogen has to be to get this trigger. We think 50 or 60% less than resting value. But again, we're not 100% sure there. Let's get back to what we were talking about. The AMPK is if you like, the fuel gauge of the muscle. So under times of stress, in other words, low glycogen, it is turned on maximally. It is activated. So you've got this enzyme in the muscle, analogous to a petrol gauge. When fuel status is low, as in during exercise, it turns on. Now, the interesting thing is that this enzyme is upstream from a very, very important factor called PGC1, which has been called the master switch for mitochondrial biogenesis. Mitochondrial biogenesis being the making, if you like, in the muscle of new mitochondria. So AMPK is upstream of this transcription factor. When AMPK is turned on, and it's turned on absolutely maximally in conditions of low muscle glycogen, it's a signal to turn on PGC1, which in turn is a transcription factor for mitochondrial biogenesis. So one of the mechanistic things is more mitochondria. And that's a really important adaptation if you're an endurance athlete. Not so important for you, Mike, or the strength trained fraternity. You don't need that many mitochondria, so you can relax there. But that's one of the mechanisms. And we've shown quite clearly that under conditions of low glycogen, when you start a training session with low glycogen, two things happen. Firstly, even when we take that first biopsy at rest, your AMPK levels are a little bit higher than normal. In other words, the muscle is experiencing stress even when you're at rest. And remember, that's why we're sleeping low. I hope this is all making sense now, because that enzyme level is probably high throughout the 12 hours of overnight, not fasting, but low carbohydrate availability. Then we start the exercise session and we take a biopsy at the exercise after the exercise session with training low, and the AMPK levels are twofold higher than they were before. So you're getting a double whammy there. You're getting the enzyme activity being elevated throughout a prolonged period of sleeping low, but then you're getting the exercise hit the next morning or whenever it happens to be, where again, the enzyme levels are very, very high. And again, that is the signal for some of the, what we call downstream cascades to activate this PGC1 transcriptional coactivator and turn on mitochondrial biogenesis. So there's some of the mechanistic adaptations. Now, I'm going to ask the follow-up question, because why then is it not turning into a performance enhancement? And that's a really good question. And I think the review that referred to, is correct. It did a good review of the literature and it said on average performance wasn't improved. Maybe, as I've alluded to, performance is not measured accurately in the lab, but maybe in the case of the athletes that we're working with, they're so elite already that, there's nowhere further to go. So in the early studies where they saw the very first study of training low, they saw massive improvements in performance. In that one-legged kicking study, the time to exhaustion was twice as long. Now that's ludicrous. You're never going to go twice as long or twice as fast or twice as far. They were untrained subjects. So to take someone from ground zero to X is fine, but we're already with our athletes at X plus 10. So to get X plus 10.1 is even very, very hard. And maybe that's the reason that, some of these strategies, we can't quite measure performance improvements, but certainly, as I said before, and I'm coming back to it again, the psychological benefit of doing this and making the athlete mentally tougher may be much more important than any physiological adaptation.
Excellent. John, I have one last question for you in an attempt to kind of cover the whole spectrum here when it comes to training low. So we've talked about anaerobic athletes. We've talked about endurance athletes. I am curious to get your perspective on training low for the longevity chasers. I've been hearing more about this from popular figures in the health field, and they might not be partaking in this evening session that depletes a large amount of glycogen, but they're definitely recommending fasted training in the morning. And to my knowledge, they're kind of extrapolating from this research, and they're basing this recommendation off of these mitochondrial adaptations and the fact that in the literature, we have these associations with mitochondrial dysfunction and insulin resistance, so that while their performance might be compromised in the session, they're not worried about the performance. They're not athletes. They're just trying to live longer and be healthier. Based on everything you know about this topic, does this seem like a potentially worthwhile approach for those who just want to be healthier humans?
Wow, that's a big question. I'll get into trouble however I answer this with either the fasting brigade or the time restricted feeding brigade or whatever. Look, let's go back to come forward and I'll try and answer it as succinctly as possible. There's no question that if you're a lower organism, a worm or a rodent or the such like, periods of prolonged fasting are beneficial for the lifespan. The longevity curves of these animals are definitely extended. There's no question about that. I'm not too sure the athlete is too worried about whether they're going to live to 85 or 90, to be completely honest. The athlete, they're generally concerned with performance. Some of these nutritional strategies, I think, have been overhyped, the fasting diets, the 800 kilocalories a day, the 5+2 or whatever it is. Look, I mean, you name it, there's a book for it and there's an expert who's written the book on it. And, there's very little scientific evidence for the most part. Is training lower strategies that will help you live longer? I have no idea, to be completely honest, Mike. I doubt it. And, in the end, who cares? I'd rather die on my bike at 80, and go out with a bang than wither away sort of thing and be 90. And I don't think that the number at the end of your life is really what we should be working on. I think it's quality of life. And if you want the answer on that, albeit glibly, I mean, I love doing these training sessions, even though they're hard, they feel terrible at the time, but there's an immense satisfaction. And I think that's probably what we should be aiming for. More satisfaction, more enjoyment, more fun. I don't care whether we're 90 or 89 at the end of the day. But having said that, I hope I'm still cycling and training low at 80, but maybe not.
Fantastic. As always, John, I greatly appreciate our conversations. Your insight is invaluable on these topics. I really appreciate your time. For the listeners, do we have a social media to plug? You're active on Twitter, aren't you?
Yeah, semi-active. I make the odd comment here and there. When we've got a study to publish, I do, but we haven't got much to publish at the moment. But I'm often a lot of people do email in and ask for reprints and stuff that they can't get, and I'm always happy to oblige there, and providing it's not infringing the copyright of the journal and the such like. But I just say to your audience, keep reading, keep experimenting. You're an N of one at the end of the day, and if it works for you, keep doing it, no matter what I say. I mean, at the end of the day, if it works for you, doesn't really matter what the experts are telling you.
Wonderful note to end on, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. That does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast.